For example, we usually don't use the word slave. We use the word enslaved person or simply enslaved. Sometimes for shorthand and to use the common terminology of the time, we will say slave, like a slave sale or something like that. We also don't use the word owner or master unless it's within the context of the time. We use the word enslaver because they actively enslaved other human beings. We often don't use the word runaway because that implies that they're doing something wrong. We instead use the terms freedom seekers or self-emancipators. I'll be talking about overt and covert resistance today, and you'll see those terms on the screen. So some examples of those are covert, things like breaking things, breaking tools, working slowly, just any type of resistance to save energy, save their spirit, save their pride, that was not directly noticeable that they could have done. So it was something that was done kind of passively, if you will. Overt forms of resistance were insurrections. And self-emancipating, or seeking freedom, was an example of both overt and covert resistance. Overt in the way that enslavers put ads in the paper, naming them, describing them, making it very, very obvious that they had sought their own freedom, but covert in the way that it had to be done secretly and stealthily in order to have any chance of working. We will have a question and answer session at the end in the fellowship hall, but I might use terms that you're not familiar with. And if you're not familiar with it, chances are other people aren't either. So I encourage you to raise your hand. Sometimes I forget that not everybody works in a history museum. So I usually have my face in a book, so please let me know if you don't understand what I'm saying. Let's see. I will be asking for a little bit of audience interaction. If you're comfortable, I hope that you will participate. He and two other men from Annapolis sent or I don't know really the verb for it, but I don't know if they owned the ship or commissioned the ship or what, I don't know those details, but they placed an ad for a ship in Annapolis at London town with about 150 people aboard that had been brought from from Angola. The ship stopped in Barbados, which was a sugar plantation island, and it was, surprisingly to a lot of us, it was run by Quakers. Quakers were heavily into the slave trade at that time, and eventually over 100 years made their way out of that and then finally formally condemned it as a church or sect. but they profited heavily from it. So the ship from Angola stopped in Barbados, probably sold several people, and then made its way up to Maryland. So that is just some background on the Snowden family. Now I'm going to go into a more general overview. So the cultural understanding of slavery and resistance is heavily influenced by historians. Not me necessarily, but historians who wrote books about the subject and that became kind of seminal research pieces for the general public. Teaching Hard History is a website and podcast that I recommend you all listen to. It's about teaching hard history, including slavery and other things, to students of all ages, and they recommend throughout that it be age appropriate, but that we just not gloss over it and pretend that it didn't happen. So anyway, if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend that podcast. And I will be sending Amy a resource list, and that will be on there too. So anyway, this podcast has an episode with historian Kenneth Greenberg. He gives a really interesting overview of historians who have studied and written about slavery over time. In 1918, Ulrich Bonnell Phillips' American Negro Slavery was widely hailed as the most comprehensive and accurate study of American slavery. Phillips did thorough research and found that there wasn't much resistance to slavery, that enslaved people were passive and agreeable because enslavers were kind and benevolent. So we know now, of course, that that is not true. That was 1918. So here is a question for you. If you would like to weigh in, please do. If Ulrich did thorough research, why do you think he found that enslaved people were passive and that enslavers were benevolent? Anybody have any guesses? Yes? Yeah, well, yeah, he probably did. I don't think he asked many enslaved, and if he had, what might have happened? Yes, ma'am. Filtered, yes, filtered by maybe their own fear, because it was only 1918. It was only about 40 years after the end of the Civil War. So many formerly enslaved people and their children were still alive and afraid to tell the truth. Many enslavers and their children were still alive, or former enslavers were still alive. They had fought against slavery ending. They were still bitter about the war and didn't want the truth known. Many white people who read the book thought that it was trustworthy scholarship. But my guess is that many black people knew better. This is an image, excuse me a second, by Edward Williams Clay in 1841, so before the end of the Civil War. I don't know how well you can see it, but it shows a white family on the upper right, kind of pointing to enslaved people around them who don't seem discontent. And the text at the top says on the left, and pardon the language here, I'm reading what's on the screen. Some things that you'll see on the screen later I will not say, but you will still see them. Anyway, so at the upper left it says, "God bless you, Massa. You feed us and clothe us. When we are sick, you nurse us, and when too old to work, you provide for us." And the master vows piously, "These poor creatures are a sacred legacy from my ancestors, and while a dollar is left me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness." So it's perpetuating the benevolent enslaver and the contented enslaved. And so it wasn't just books, it was a lot of imagery that was in magazines and books and everywhere. But Phillips' research, even though he thought he was doing thorough research, really corroborated this perception. The next really popular piece was a 1959 book called Slavery, A Problem in American and Slavery, A Problem in American Intellectual and Institutional Life. And this was by Stanley Elkins. That's him as a young man and him as an older man. It had similar findings, ironically, because, well, let me get to that in a second. He compared slavery to Nazi concentration camps. He said African Americans were broken by their experience, infantilized, and became submissive because of that. And of course, there has to be some truth in that. However, ironically, he came to the same conclusion as Phillips, that there was no resistance, not because enslaved people were content and enslavers kind, but because just the opposite. Enslavers were brutal and enslaved were broken, so they had no will to resist or rebel. So unintentionally, Elkins perpetuated the little black Sambo image of African Americans who had been enslaved. In the 1960s and 70s, a number of scholars began rejecting the Sambo stereotype. They focused on rebellions like Nat Turner's rebellion and found that there were comparatively few insurrections compared to the overthrows in the Caribbean, like the Haitian overthrow. But it's not a good comparison because, first of all, enslavers didn't write about insurrections. This was a hidden history. This was a forgotten, hidden, not mentioned history when it happened. So it was kind of hard to find examples of it. Plus, plantations here in this country were much smaller than the ones in the Caribbean, like the ones in Barbados that I talked about, and in Haiti. So they were comparing apples and oranges. So it wasn't until the last couple of decades that scholars really started studying resistance and even insurrections, covert resistance like insurrections, and finding what really happened here in this country. So a book was published in 2004 by Stephanie Camp. It's called Closer to Freedom, which will be on the resource list. The subtitle is Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South. And what she did was she researched diaries and letters by a lot of enslaving women who didn't have a lot of legal property rights to own enslaved people. So I don't know, that's a whole other discussion. But they were enslavers, and they did have a more intimate relationship with the house enslaved people. So, and they wrote in journals, they wrote in letters, they communicated with each other that way. And they did write complaints. So she studied a lot of those and came up with a lot of examples that had never been looked at before. For example, there was one young woman, enslaved woman, who this enslaving woman hit in the head a lot. And of course, she was fed up with that, so she put hat pins in her hair. She had hat pins in her hair with a point sticking out. And she was gonna get hit anyway, so she resisted that way. So things like that happened a lot, and that's a wonderful book. It's hard to read, but it's a wonderful study of the many, many ways that enslaved women of the South resisted. So I chose this image when talking about this book because to me this woman looks like someone who has or is going to or is in the act of resisting at this very moment. I love her defiant stance, the scar in her mouth, and even the way her dress is kind of coming off. She's being herself. And in Africa, a lot of women did, wear their clothing like this. So she's being who she is. So, let's see. Oops, pointing that wrong. There we go. So again, imagery had a lot to do with how people perceived resistance, and images like this shows, even in Africa, well, it shows passiveness in Africa, but in actuality, this is a slave market in Africa. In reality, villages and towns built fortifications and warning systems to prevent attacks from slave traders. If captured and forced onto ships for the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans resisted by organizing hunger strikes, forming rebellions, even committing suicide by leaping overboard rather than live in slavery. It is believed that roughly one slaving voyage in every 10 experienced major rebellions. These rebellions were costly for European traders and led them to avoid certain regions known for their resistance, such as Upper Guinea. So this resulted in fewer Africans from these areas entering the transatlantic slave trade, and suggests that African resistance proves that African resistance strategies were effective. And now we're going to talk a little bit about resistance in the Middle Passage, which I just talked a little bit about. There were insurrections in the middle, on the journey, and there were suicides. And in a minute, we're going to show a video about the Amistad. But I just wanted to show you this image. You've probably seen this one or ones like it, which is kind of a diagram that many people, and I did, thought of as how to pack a slave ship. And it is that, but it's also how to pack a slave ship humanely, because this was done by abolitionists who were on the site. I don't know where this was drawn, but it was an actual slave ship called the Vigilante. And they are showing how to pack it with people more humanely. And on the left, this shows the shackles used. They were trying to show people what was really happening. So what we think of as, it was worse. It was much worse, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and now we're going to show a video on the Amistad.
Did you know the Amistad Mutiny? The Amistad Mutiny was a 19th century slave rebellion off the coast of Cuba that had important political and legal implications for the American abolition movement. On July 2nd, 1839, 53 recently captured Africans revolted on the Spanish slave ship Amistad on its way from Havana to Puerto Príncipe, Cuba. Led by Joseph Cinque, the Africans freed themselves and took over the ship, ordering the surviving Spaniards to take them back to Sierra Leone. Instead, the Spaniards secretly sailed north, and the ship was seized 2 months later by the U.S. Navy off the coast of Long Island, New York. The mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut, where they awaited a federal trial to decide whether they would return to enslavement. While abolitionists encouraged public sympathy for the captive Africans, the U.S. government took a pro-slavery stance. President Martin Van Buren anticipated a ruling against the defendants, so he ordered a Navy ship to prepare to deliver them to Cuba after the trial, an action he thought would gain him pro-slavery votes in the upcoming election. Surprisingly, the court sided with the defendants after trial testimony established that, although slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves was not. The judge ruled that the African rebels were victims of kidnapping and had the right to escape in any way possible. The U.S. government appealed the results to the Supreme Court, where the mutineers were defended by former President John Quincy Adams. The court upheld the previous ruling, and the surviving 35 Africans were freed and sailed back home, arriving in Sierra Leone in 1842.
Okay, so we're going to shift from the very overt form of resistance of insurrection and mutiny to much more covert and still very powerful form of resistance being religion. In a physical fight like a mutiny, there are clear winners and losers, but when it comes to what's in people's hearts, it's much harder to control that. So for enslavers, religion was one of the most morally and legally challenging aspects of slavery. Passages like from the Bible, like slaves, be obedient to your human masters with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ. So that's the Bible messages that they wanted enslaved people to hear. And many enslavers wanted their enslaved to be baptized because it would help spread Christianity and hopefully make the enslaved less rebellious. But in 1664 in Maryland, the lower house of the assembly outlined a problem for the upper house when they said, let's see. It is desired by the lower house that the upper house would be pleased to draw up an act obliging Negroes to serve durante vita, which means for life, we thinking it very necessary for the prevention of the damage that masters of such slaves may sustain by such slaves pretending to be christened, and so plead the law of England. And that's referring to a court case in England where the ruling was that Africans could be enslaved, Africans could be enslaved because they were that it was okay to enslave Africans because they were not Christian. So, sorry for my stumbling here. So if they were baptized and they were no longer infidels, they were Christian, it wasn't okay to enslave them. Abolitionists responded to this by baptizing as many enslaved people as they possibly could. But eventually lawmakers justified slavery on the grounds that it was a valuable source of labor that was at stake. And in Virginia, it was declared that if by the charity and piety of their owners slave children are baptized, the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. Another problem with religion for enslavers was unruliness, often because of a form of expression that they did not find appropriate in a church setting. So an act was drawn up in Prince George's County in 1828 for the district that is where Piscataway is in southern Prince George's County. And it says that there is a meeting house used exclusively by persons of color as a place of public worship. And that said house is a nuisance to the neighborhood and tends to demoralizing the slaves. So they went on to say that there were only certain hours that enslaved people could use that space for worship, and also that white people had to be present when they were worshiping. And The word demoralizing, I thought it kind of meant like disheartening. I kind of equated it with the word disheartening, and that's not what they meant at all. They meant that they felt that they were being immoral by worshiping in the way that they did. So, I mean, they couldn't win. So for enslaved on the other hand, this is just a picture of the act for Prince George's County. And this is a picture of black and white people worshiping together. And I like the way this lady is looking off in the distance. And in the background, I think, kind of doing the same thing. It just looks to me a very repressive kind of service for them. So for the enslaved, religion was a very powerful form of resistance. Passages like, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and also those who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on Christ like putting on new clothes. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female." So this is borne out in many testimonies by formerly enslaved people themselves. How many of you are familiar with the Slave Narrative Project? Okay, so this was done in the 1930s. It was part of FDR's, thank you, New Deal, where he was trying to employ many, many people. And what he did with people like English professors and reporters and things like that is he sent out armies of people to interview formerly enslaved people before they died, so they could get first-hand accounts. And that will be on your resource list as well. There was one gentleman named Dennis Sims. He was enslaved by the Contis on their plantation on Conti Road. And he talks about how they worshipped. He said, "We stuck pretty, well, he goes into, okay, I'll just read it. "We stuck pretty close to the cabins after dark, for if we were caught roaming about, we would be unmercifully whipped. We were never allowed to congregate after work, never went to church. We could not read nor write, for we were kept in ignorance. We were very unhappy." Nevertheless, Sims goes on to say, "Sometimes we would, unbeknown to our master, assemble in a cabin and sing songs and spirituals. Our favorite spirituals are bringing in the sheaves, the stars are shining on us all, and the devil has no place here. The singing was usually to the accompaniment of a Jew's harp, fiddle, or banjo." So, at the risk of grave punishment, they did it anyway. And that's something that we see over and over and over again, no matter what the punishment is. If it was important enough to the enslaved, they would do it. So the passages that I read before that were probably speaking more to the enslaved about freedom might have been the type of passages that inspired Nat Turner in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, and in the largest insurrection in American history took place. And this is a watercolor, I think, of Nat Turner, his dreams. He dreamed that God was speaking to him, and he dreamed of an insurrection. So what we're going to do now is play a video about that insurrection.
Early on the morning of August 22nd, 1831, a group of slaves crept into the plantation house that once stood on these Virginia fields. They killed the planter and his wife. Then they killed the children. The bloodiest slave revolt in American history was underway. Over the next 2 days, more than 60 white people would die.
They go house to house, and as they go, they pretty much kill every man, woman, and child that they can find. It was incredibly personal. These are the people that these rebels were killing were often people whom they'd grown up with, whose parents had enslaved their parents.
The slaves were led by a man named Nat Turner, a self-styled prophet who claimed that God had told him to slay his enemies. In hindsight, his motives seem much simpler. Why did he do it? Why him? Why here? Why then?
He did it because slavery was awful. Slavery was horrible. He did it because daily he was watching communities be torn apart. He did it because he knew the stories of women abused by slave owners. He knew the stories of how from farm to farm being split up was horrible. And he knew the constant threat of being shipped away.
Turner's revolt was crushed on this field by a local militia. Looking back, it's easy to see it as a suicide mission, the desperate act of a people pushed too far. But it was more than that. Turner made real the secret hopes of millions of slaves, and he sent shockwaves across slave-holding America.
The Nat Turner Revolt happens in an international context where not only are the abolitionists in the North beginning to gear up their agitation against slavery, but also in the British Empire, slavery is on its last legs. In 1838, it's over, and slavery has ended in the British Empire. Southern planters are overwhelmingly concerned with this. They know that if slavery is not defended aggressively, it's going to be over, right? And Nat Turner is just one warning signal among many that they're on the losing side of a global battle.
So the Nat Turner insurrection is the most well-known, but there was another little-known insurrection, little-known because it hasn't been talked about, that happened right here in Maryland, right here in Prince George's County. In July of 1845, Mark Caesar, a free black man, and Bill Wheeler, an enslaved black man, both of Charles County, led an estimated 75 enslaved men who set out to walk toward their freedom in Pennsylvania. The two were joined by enslaved men from neighboring St. Mary's County, and they made their way through Prince George's County, continually amassing a larger crowd as they were joined by Prince George's County slaves as well. This is mostly from a newspaper. The slaves were armed with weapons to protect themselves, among which reportedly included pistols, loaded bludgeons, scythes, blades, swords, clubs, butcher's knives, etc. Now again, we don't know how reliable this report is. The group was said to have been headed by a powerful Negro fellow, sword in hand. And here are direct quotes from the newspaper. They had to be fired upon before they would surrender. People look out for him, meaning Mark Caesar, as lots of money will be forked over to anyone who may nab him. The Maryland Journal wrote, "This is the most daring movement which has ever come under our observation. We have heard of gangs of Negroes traveling through parts of the country sparsely inhabited, but never before have we heard of their taking to the public road in open day, within 2 miles of a county town, and in a thickly settled neighborhood." So Bill Wheeler was eventually sentenced to hang, but was never apprehended. Mark Caesar was sentenced to 40 years in jail, but he died before. He died after 5 years of consumption. But this is something you really have to dig to find, and it was pretty big. Self-emancipation, aka running away. I chose this picture because I love how smartly it seems this man has planned his journey, and I like to think he's at least finding a moment of peace. Self-emancipation is the most well-known form of resistance. In Prince George's County between 1830 and 1850, there were, which is a 20-year span, there were about 1,500, which is about 30 a year, runaway ads placed. In Anne Arundel County, there was about 1,200, which is about 26 a year. And this comes out to about one every 2 to 3 weeks. The Snowdens of Montpelier specifically averaged 3 to 4 a year in a 4-year time span. However, there were many, many Snowdens, and some were Quakers, some were abolitionists, but most of them were enslavers. And we are going through a process of counting all of the ads that they placed. But we haven't come up to a total yet. These can be found, by the way, in the Maryland State Archives. They have a certain database that has all this information. It's very helpful. So, seeking freedom was a very risky business. There were patrols everywhere who hunted runaways with trained dogs. Monetary rewards were offered to the general public through runaway ads for the capture and return of self-emancipators, and laws allowing the general public to capture and even beat freedom seekers. Still, some did. For example, remember Dennis Sims, enslaved by the Contis. He talked about in his interview about an enslaved person who he knew. Well, first of all, he talked about how the Contis would brand, as in branding cattle, any captured self-emancipator. They would brand them on the cheek. And he knew a man on the plantation who was branded. And later, Conti places a runaway ad and describes the man in the ad, because it gave very detailed descriptions in hopes of getting them returned, as having a brand on his cheek, which means that the man had already sought his freedom once before and was returned and was doing it again. So we know why they would want to, but also the question is, why would they risk, in what conditions would they risk seeking their own freedom? This is an ad placed by Thomas Snowden, and I'll let you read it. Can you all read it well enough? Or is it hard to see? It's hard to see, okay. Well, this is for a man named George. He explains his everything that he's wearing and everything that he might have brought with him to wear. And he's saying that he was purchased by Mr. James Rigby of Huntingtown in Calvert County, and it's probable that he will go there to be harbored. And it's also possible that he may try to get to Pennsylvania, and on the way to pass as a free man. So this gives us clues as to, what conditions one needs to hope to have in order to be able to successfully escape. So other forms of resistance, like I mentioned, are things like breaking tools, working slowly, and all kinds of other things that you can read about in the new scholarship that is being done. But one surprising way that people resisted was by doing really good work. This is a plow that was made in the Snowden Iron Works, and it belonged to George Washington. He ordered it specially for Mount Vernon as a template for all of the plows that he was going to use on the plantation to be made by his own enslaved workers. So, I mean, it's hard for me to know exactly why this is such a good plow because I'm not a farmer, but George Washington could have anything he wanted, and he wanted plows made by these men because of their skill. And by the way, Richard Snowden, the slave trader who had been to Angola, probably the reason he went to Angola is because they were known for their skill in ironworking. They were very skilled in that part of Africa, and that happened a lot. They would target certain areas because they had the skills that they needed. So anyway, this skill, that had been generations earlier with that slave ship, but you know, it had been passed down through the generations, and they made very good plows. So now here's a question for you. Why am I saying that doing really good work is a form of resistance? What would inspire someone to do that if they were being mistreated every single day? Yes, it might be better treatment, did you say? Yes, a form of negotiation, because that happened all the time. They might get paid, they might get sent somewhere that they might rather be, they might get certain privileges. What other reasons? So one might just be pride, they wanted to do a good job. They had been, had inherited and been taught these skills, and they wanted to do a good job. Another reason might be that their friends and families were out in the fields, and they didn't want to see them plowing with subpar equipment and doing anything that's going to make their lives even more difficult than they already were. Before I talk about literacy, I also want to mention a form of resistance was falling in love and starting a family. Here in Prince George's County, the Plummer family of Riversdale, there was a man on that property, an enslaved man named Adam Plummer, and he married a woman named Emily. They had one of the few legal marriages that's known anywhere, so they actually had a marriage license, and they had 9 children together. Now, I'm sure they wanted a marriage license, but I think they also had a plan, because they tried to use their marriage license as proof that they were free, because enslaved people couldn't legally marry. So they had a plan to escape to Canada using their marriage license as proof that they were free. But one of Emily's relatives learned about the plot and reported them. And in 1851, Emily and some of their children were sold to another plantation. They were moved often, and at one point, Emily and her children were even jailed for trying to escape. Adam visited them whenever he possibly could, and in a letter from Adam to Emily, he says, "I am myself very much downhearted to see the children scattered abroad, and you and me far apart, to see the little children shed tears for the loss of their father." Excuse me. So finally, at emancipation, 13 years later, they were together again, and both Emily and Adam were earning wages to support their family. And we have a story kind of like that from the Snowdens of Montpelier. We don't really know what happened because we don't have letters from them, but we do know that in 1804, Thomas Snowden's estate inventory included 2 young people named Henny and Hazel, who were 7 and 8 years old. We look again in his son's estate inventory of 1832, and Henny and Hazel appear again at ages 35 and 36. Then, in Nicholas's widow's manumission document, which is a document that legally frees people before emancipation happened, that was 1838, and they are there again at ages 41 and 43 with their children, Nace, Let, Anne Elizabeth, and Sarah Jane. So, it's good to know that they were together. So, literacy. Another form of resistance was learning to read and write. Although Maryland had no laws prohibiting it, literacy for the enslaved was strongly discouraged. A Maryland law passed in 1806 regarding freedom certificates, which, like not what Emily's trying to use, but they were just pieces of paper showing that they were legally free, spells out one reason literacy was so threatening to enslavers. Whereas great mischiefs have taken place from slaves coming into possession of the certificates of free Negroes by running away and passing as free. And so it wasn't just they were coming into possession, they were writing them as well, if they could. So many states, however, especially in the Deep South, had very, very prohibiting laws against literacy. This is a picture of a woman named Lou Williams, and she was part of the Slave Narrative Project. And I'm going to read to you. Unfortunately, that's too large. Well, anyway, hopefully you can read that. I don't like reading this out loud, but can you all see that well enough? Okay. And this is a direct transcription from, sorry, this was a different lady. This was not Lou Williams. This was a woman named Phoebe Rogers. This is also something I won't read every word of anyway, but if you can read it yourselves, that would be better. Everybody had a chance to read it. So that last slide shows you that man, Enoch Golden, was not only teaching people, but that people were willing to learn, knowing that, death would be the penalty. So that shows you what a high premium enslaved people put on literacy and education. After the Civil War, they wasted no time building schools and churches. That was a top priority. In Prince George's County alone, there were 157 Rosenwald schools. Rosenwald was a man who, he was one of the founders of Sears store, and he used his money to build schools for formerly enslaved children or the children of formerly enslaved parents. So there were 147 in Maryland and 27 in Prince George's County, of which 9 remain. This is a restored one in Capitol Heights called the Ridgely Rosenwald School. It is open for visitation, and I'll put that in your resources list. They also wasted no time building universities, HBCUs, which stands for Historically Black and Historically Black Colleges and Universities. So even before the end of the Civil War in Pennsylvania and Ohio, some were built, and then here in Maryland, Howard University and Morgan State were both founded in 1867, very shortly after the Civil War. Another form of freedom, which I haven't yet included in this talk, you guys are my second audience. I did the first talk of this yesterday, and somebody in the audience brought this up, so I will add it, but they're freedom suits. Freedom suits were, as in legal cases, where enslaved people took their enslavers to court trying to win freedom, and many of them did succeed, not all of them, but many did. And there's a really good book on this I'll put on your resource list called A Question of Freedom by William G. Thomas. I'm almost done with the talk, and when I am, we're going to play a little bit of an audio. But before I do that, I want to get back to the question I posed at the beginning. Why do you think we call this talk Defying the Odds? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Okay. Well, it's because we hope that you've come to the conclusion that you can enslave a body, but not a spirit. Enslaved people did and do resist at every turn. They walled villages in Africa. They waged mutinies on the sea. They worshipped at the risk of being whipped. They learned to read and write at the risk of dismemberment. They self-emancipated at the risk of torture. They fell in love and built, this one always gets me, built families at the risk of never seeing them again. Enslavers tried to break and control them, but they defied the odds. And now, in honor of Dennis Sims, enslaved by the Contis, I'd like to play a little bit of Bringing in the Sheaves, sung by the Maceo Woods Christian Tabernacle Choir of Chicago in 1991. This is one of his favorite hymns.
Into the new year in style with Verizon Home Internet. Got it for just $25 a month. No hidden fees, no surprise price hikes, just the 100% fiber optic network. So it's super fast and reliable.
Sorry.
This baby has upload speeds as fast as...
It's a really small mouse.
The morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the new day. In the dewy listen, waiting for the harvest. And the time of reaping, and we shall rejoice, bringing in the sheep.
Okay, we can hear the rest, or we can adjourn for questions and answers.
Bring 'em in.
Well, let me thank you, Ms. Burnham, for your remarks. I'll keep that playing in the background. I know that you have to leave at noon, and we
I
are
could
getting
stay for
pretty close
maybe-
to that.
Yeah, I could
Um,
stay for another.
So I
15
wonder if we
minutes.
might just, if people have questions or observations, they can pose those to you now. I'll come up here. And we'll, in lieu of Amazing Grace, we will have the Reverend Macios Woods and the Christian Tabernacle Choir singing of Bringing in the Sheaves. Because I know that you need to run, and I imagine others do. But thank you very much. I would invite all of you to pay a visit to Montpelier or to Riversdale. The day book, or diary of Mr. Adam Francis Plummer is actually digitized, and you can read it online. It's a remarkable document, a very rare document. So
we have our calendar of events in the fellowship hall as well.
Fellowship hall and right back here. So at the risk of, I'll have to run back there and stop that in a moment so that the choir can have its extroit. But I'm just going to let Reverend Maceo Woods give us the benediction because he's already been doing that for a few minutes. I wish you all a really amazing week, and I'd invite you to consider, given all that Ms. Burnham was talking about and the forms of resistance, it becomes a little easier to connect to gospel, sort of joyous, rapturous gospel, once freedom is obtained. And especially as you know and understand how tenuous that freedom can be. So I wish you all a very blessed week. And choir, I'll let you take it from here. So, the Lord be with all of you. Greet each other with signs of peace and joy.